Good morning, Skallywags, and welcome to another episode of a series of Enigmatic events. My name is Shpoo.
And I'm AJ.
Quick disclaimer, guys, this episode gets pretty heavy at times, so definitely want to throw it out there. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Most likely, you have heard of a man by the name of Herman Mudgett, also known as H.H. Holmes.
I've heard of them.
Absolutely. Basically, he is the man who is generally given the title of America's first serial killer.
But what if I told you that there was a murderer who beat him to that title? And what if I told you that it's possible that it could tie to a very famous serial killer? Probably the most famous. None other than Jack the Ripper. Now, we're not going to be talking about the Ripper case today. We are going to be talking about a case in America called the Servant Girl Annihilator.
So our story begins 3 years before the events in Whitechapel on December 30th, 1884 in Austin, Texas. Late that night, a knock came on the door of a man by the name of William Hall. Obviously irritated that someone had just woke him up, Hall went and answered the door, where he found a man by the name of Walter Spencer. Walter Spencer was bleeding profusely from a wound on his head and obviously very, very distraught. Mr. Spencer, begging for help, said that he had just been attacked and that his girlfriend, who was also Mr. Hall's cook, had been abducted. Mr. Hall simply assumed that Mr. Spencer, who was a black man in Austin, Texas in the 1800s, was drunk and told him he should simply go find a doctor and wake him up. And he slammed the door in Mr. Spencer's face. Basically, because he was a black man in Texas in the 1800s, he feared that he didn't have any other options. He wasn't about to knock on the door again and anger Mr. Hall further, so he did just that. He went off to find a doctor.
Well, with a head injury like that, it was probably a good thing that he
Right.
did. Because he did survive. The following morning, Mr. Hall woke up and he decided to investigate. Not necessarily believing what the man had said, but he walked down to the quarters of his cook, Molly Smith. This is Mr. Spencer's girlfriend. What he found there was a gruesome sight. The room was obviously a scene of some kind of struggle, and there was a bloody axe in the corner. There was a trail of blood that led out the door and into the backyard. Mr. Hall followed it, and a mere 5 feet from his outhouse, he found the body of his cook, Molly Smith, sprawled out in what the local paper would call a grisly murder filled with copious amounts of blood due to axe wounds to her head, abdomen, chest, legs, and arms.
Another paper that was called The Statesman also went on to say, one of the most horrible murders that ever a reporter was called on to chronicle, a deed most unparalleled in atrocity of its execution. And on a personal note, I can only imagine what it had to have been like to know that you and your significant other had been attacked. You had been already struck in the head with an axe. You're bleeding profusely. You're probably getting pretty dizzy by this point just from the amount of blood that you're losing. And all that you know as far as your significant other is concerned is that she's been taken by whoever did this. So you go to the nearest place that you can think of just in search of any kind of help. Knock on the door, the guy comes to the door, you tell him what happens, and he slams the door in your face? Knowing that in this kind of situation that time means everything, he probably cost Molly her life just by closing a door. So even though it's been over 100 years, I just would like to take this moment to say, William Hall, you are a douchebag of the greatest caliber.
So after this first murder, things went pretty quiet, at least for a while. There were some incidents that people have claimed were part of this. There was a bunch of servants who said that somebody was trying to get into their door. They would see the doorknob jingle, but when they went to the door to look to see who was there was nobody there. There was women being grabbed in alleys, but they would get away. There were a couple that people tend to put with this case, but it's not
canonical.
Yeah,
basically.
It's not canonical.
Yeah.
But there was 2 Swedish servant girls walking home. They were attacked Both survived and then moved away from Austin after their attack.
And we'll kind of come back to that. We bring that up for a reason. It's not going to come back until right toward the end, but just kind of keep all of that stuff in mind for the time being.
Yeah, but the police, even back then, didn't know if they were connected. First of
Right.
all, they only had one murder to go off of with Molly, and then just these incidences that were happening
Right.
around their city.
So they seemed pretty trivial and random at the moment. And honestly, to this day even, they still don't consider them canon, but we bring them up for a specific reason, and we'll get back to that.
So now we fast forward to May 6th, to the home of Eliza Shelley, who was also a cook. She and her 3 children were asleep in her home on the property of her employer, Dr. Lucian B. Johnson. Eliza became the second canonized victim. She was sleeping in her bed with her 8-year-old son when he woke up with a man standing above him and his mother. The man grabbed him, threw him to the floor, covered him with a blanket, and whispered to him, "Shh, be quiet." The boy stayed under the blanket the whole time while hearing his mother scream.
Meanwhile, Dr. Johnson was awoken by the exact same screams. He got out of bed, he put on his shoes, and he went out to the back to kind of investigate. Unfortunately, by the time he got there, it was already over. Suffice to say that he arrived to a very grisly scene. As he described it in his own words, it seemed to be that she was struck by an axe as to reveal her brain. Her head had been completely split in half. Investigators also found a number of puncture wounds also in her head, but they couldn't identify what the second object was. And unlike the first case, neither of these weapons were left at the scene. Another difference from the first case is that Eliza had been raped.
The only evidence left at the crime scene was a set of bloody footprints. One of the footprints was a bare foot, and it was missing a little toe.
Just 3 weeks later, on May 25th, 1885, there is a third attack. This time, the victim was Irene Cross, who was another kitchen server in the neighborhood. Irene was attacked late at night in her small cabin where she lived with her son, Washington Cross, and her nephew, Douglas Brown. Douglas was actually in the room when the attack began, and just like the case with Eliza Shelley's son, he was thrown from the bed, covered with a blanket, and told not to say a word, which he did, sitting back and hearing his aunt's screams.
Investigators discovered Irene Cross's body with severe wounds to the head, stab wounds by a knife, and it was reported that it looked like she had been scalped. Also, her right arm had been severed from her body with a knife, and she too had been raped. Unlike Eliza Shelley, she did not succumb to her injuries right away. She did die a little later, but she was alive for a little bit.
So in the first bit of a twist here, investigators said that this case was actually different from the others in that there was no axe used this time, only a knife. It was also around this time that they started to speculate that Molly Smith may have been raped as well. They did find her with her undergarments partially removed, which has become a trend at this point, so they've pretty much just started to tack that on as part of this guy's MO. But even with all of the differences, just due to the sheer nature of the attack, the brutality of the attack, the location where it happened, the fact that the killer covered the nephew with a blanket and told them to be quiet, there were so many similarities that even though there were so many differences, they were certain that it was the same guy. That will be important later as well.
Yeah.
So bear that in mind.
Unlike the Eliza Shelley's son, who did not give police any description whatsoever, Douglas did have a description. He said before the man threw the blanket over him, he saw a big, chunky black man with bare feet and his pants rolled up. That's the only description he could give, but it was at least something to go on. After this murder of Irene Cross, months went by and there was no murders. So Austin tended to feel a little bit safer, and people tended to feel a little bit more secure.
Even if that was short-lived. Because on August 31st of 1885, the killer struck yet again. And be forewarned, this is where things kind of take a dark turn, so viewer discretion strongly advised. This part is kind of hard to hear. Rebecca Ramey, who was employed as a cook at the livery stable, and her 11-year-old daughter Mary were asleep in their bed in the small quarters that they lived in behind Rebecca's employer, one Mr. Valentine Weed. Suddenly, Rebecca was woken up by someone in the room. Before she could really react, though, she was struck in the head with some unidentified sharp object and she blacked out. She went unconscious. When she woke up, she found that her 11-year-old daughter, Mary, was missing.
We're going to state this one more time. This gets dark. Viewer discretion strongly advised. Mary Ramey's 11-year-old body was found in a nearby alley in the following morning. Her brain was punctured with 2 sharp objects through her ears. She had deep cuts and lacerations all over her body, and she had been raped. Some evidence showed that she was raped while she was alive, and also again after her death. Once again, there was no weapons left at the site, so the police, being stumped, and I'm sure that the fact that it's an 11-year-old girl, they brought in bloodhounds to try to track down the killer. Unfortunately, there was so much blood that even the bloodhounds could not get a trail.
There were a few reports that claimed that there were some witnesses who had seen either a large, dark-skinned man or possibly a white man who was in blackface with a white rag over his mouth, so sort of like a bandana, handkerchief, that type of thing, and also wearing a slouch hat in the area when this happened. But basically, we couldn't find any kind of like actual police reports to substantiate those claims, so all of that is just speculation, so take that with a grain of salt. Then, just 1 month later, on September the 28th of 1885, he struck yet again. Gracie Vance and her husband, Orange Washington, lived in a small one-room shanty in the backyard of Gracie's employer, a man by the name of William Dunham. On the night of September 28th, the young couple actually had a couple of house guests, a couple of friends over. Lucinda Bodie and Patsy Gibbons. Basically, they had come over and they were staying the night. The guests were asleep on the floor, and the couple were asleep in their bed just right there beside each other. Again, this is just a one-room shack. Somewhere in the night, a man entered the room. All 4 of them were struck in the head and rendered unconscious. Once that was done, all 4 of them were hit in the head with an axe at least once. And unfortunately, for the next several minutes, we know very little about what happened next.
What we do know is at some point, Gracie was dragged from her bed out the door and 75 feet into a vacant lot. At the scene of the vacant lot, it looks like Gracie woke up and started to struggle. What I read was that there were claw marks on the ground. She was fighting for her life. From there, the evidence shows that the assailant got her on the ground, picked up a brick, and bludgeoned her to death.
And this particular attack was so violent, reports actually said that Gracie's head and face were completely unrecognizable. One report even went as far as to compare it to ground jelly. Meanwhile, while that's going on, Lucinda actually wakes up. She struggles to get to her feet, and she lights a lantern, and she runs out to look for help. And this is kind of where something happens that raises a few questions. The very moment that Lucinda gets outside, someone, and all that we know is the report says a man, yells at her to put the light out. Remember, she's carrying a lantern in one hand. She becomes extremely frightened by this, and of course she takes off running. The man comes barreling at her, tackles her to the ground, breaking the lantern in the process, and she starts screaming bloody murder.
Her screams and the sound of the glass breaking actually alerted Gracie's boss. Mr. Dunham, unlike the other boss earlier, made no haste. He ran outside to what he saw as Lucinda struggling against another man. It was in the front yard of the shack, and he says that he saw a man in a Mother Hubbard dress and a slouch hat fighting with Lucinda. Startled by Mr. Dunham's appearance, this man jumped off of her and ran away.
Like we said, this one kind of raises a couple of questions. Who is this a man? Is it the same guy that killed Gracie? Was it a different man? And if so, who? How exactly does one man enter a room with 4 people sleeping, like in very close quarters, and manage to knock them all out without waking anybody up? We'll actually dive into those questions a little bit deeper later on, but I want that to kind of soak in for a minute. That's another one of those things, just keep all of that in mind until we get there, and I promise we will get there. So investigators show up, and they're kind of helping Mr. Dunham search the property, and surprisingly, they find that Patsy Gibbons is still alive. She's still unconscious, and she's bleeding profusely from an axe wound to her head, but for the moment anyway, she is still alive. Miraculously, she and Lucinda both recovered from their injuries.
Yeah.
However, Orange, Washington, when they first arrived, he too was alive, barely clinging to life, but he was alive, still unconscious. Unfortunately, though, after a few moments, he did pass away. He had been struck several times with the axe, so it's kind of surprising that he was still alive even when they got there, but it apparently didn't take long after they did arrive. He never did actually wake up from it.
The axe used to strike down all 4 of the victims in that one-room shack was lying on the floor next to the bed, next to Orange.
So after the Vance Washington murders, the police, they increased the number of patrols in the area, and they started taking a lot more aggressive measures. Over the next few weeks, they ended up arresting over 400 men. Straight up just arresting them just to question them. Out of these 400, all of them were just kind of arrested, questioned, and released, except for 2. The last 2. But we're not there just yet, so we'll hold off on that one for a moment.
Yeah. A local paper in October of 1885 had this to say: "The crimes still remain a mystery. Their guilty author retains the secret. This seems to be a year unprecedented in the character of crime."
So whomever this killer was, he definitely seemed to be very, very decisive when it came to his victims. Every single one of the victims were black servants, either cooks or kitchen help of some sort. In fact, in every single one of the cases, not necessarily every victim, but in every case, there was at least one kitchen cook or kitchen server involved in some way, shape, or form. And sadly, this actually gave the white residents of Austin, Texas, a kind of a sense of security in a way. That is, until Christmas Eve, 1885.
On December 24th, 1885, a man named Moses Hancock awoke, feeling a sense of dread. He looked over to see that his wife was missing from her bed. He searched the house, was unable to find her, and then he searched outside. There he found his wife, Susan Hancock, lying half naked in their backyard. She was in a pool of her own blood, and she was barely hanging on to life.
Of course, Mr. Hancock screamed out, hoping to alert the neighbors. The neighbors fortunately heard him. They came over and helped him carry his wife into the parlor, where she would die shortly thereafter. Investigators said that Susan had actually been taken from her bed, carried outside, where she was hit in the head with an axe, and like many of the others, she too had been raped. Once again, we have somebody who is not only knocked out, but straight up removed from the room by someone, while the other person sleeping beside this person.
It wasn't clear if they had 2 separate beds, but they were at least in the same room.
But it's still with enough stealth that the other person in the room doesn't even so much as wake up. That is insane to me. We're not talking about, like, you know, the wind blows and causes the wood in the house to creak. We're talking a man lifting a person out of bed.
Carrying them out of the room.
I mean, you're going to be stepping pretty heavily, carrying someone, probably breathing heavily.
And I couldn't find whether the house has 2 floors or not.
1 or 2 floors, yeah. But I mean, there are so many factors at play here that it does not make any sense whatsoever. I don't get it.
So then a shock happens. The investigators are there, checking out the scene where Mrs. Hancock has been killed. And they get a call. Another woman is missing. And not just another woman, but another Caucasian woman. A Mrs. Eula Phillips, the wife of architect James Phillips. The Phillips home is saturated. They said saturated with blood, but the body is not inside the house. When detectives arrive, they search the house with her husband, and then they search outside. In the backyard is Eula Phillips. completely unclothed and dead. She had been bludgeoned to death with a large piece of wood, her head smashed in, and she too had been raped. She was also the only victim that had been found completely naked.
And then, all of a sudden, the killing just stopped.
So those are our victims. Those are the canonized victims. There were others, as we said, that might be involved in this case, but these are our victims. But now we're going to look at who are our suspects.
Well, as we mentioned a moment ago, there were over 400 men that were arrested and at least questioned, if not worse, kind of for the crimes. But each one of them was released, except for 2. Only 2 actually went as far as trial, and they were the husbands of the last 2 victims.
The 2 Caucasian women.
Yes, the 2 Caucasian males were the only 2 that actually went as far as arrested, going to trial. Mr. Hancock was acquitted pretty soon after the trial began. However, at first, Mr. Phillips was actually found guilty, but that conviction was overturned not too terribly long later.
They did have a little bit of a marital situation. There was cheating that was speculated, and
there was motive
and everything. But because the crimes fit the other murder so well, his defense attorneys did finally get his conviction overturned.
Yeah.
So if neither of them are the killer or killers, who is?
Well, there are a number of theories, and all of them are interesting. We'll go with that word. I mean, even if they don't exactly have a lot of credibility behind them, they are at the very least head scratchers, if nothing else. The kind of things that make you, interesting. Whatever. So, our first suspect, or first theory for a suspect, is a man named Buck Taylor. Buck Taylor is a cowboy, and he lived just a few miles from where all of these murders took place at, and kind of happened to actually fall under suspicion again a little while later in the Jack the Ripper case. Why, you might ask, would a cowboy from Texas be a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case? Well, he actually wasn't even a suspect in the Austin case until he became a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. And as far as why he was a suspect in Whitechapel, it was because, well, he was part of a group called the Buffalo Bill Wild West Show that were on tour in Europe during the time of the Whitechapel murders. And he kind of lived right there in the area. So here's a man who lived right there in the area during 2 different killing sprees.
I mean, a cowboy, I bet he had a slouch hat.
And I bet you in that Wild West show there was a Mother Hubbard dress. Just saying.
Costumes are a killer's friend.
Absolutely. Who's up next?
Well, next we have probably my favorite, just because it's so crazy, but I put it in here because part of it has some kind of merit. So the African American community was the ones being attacked, and they had a theory themselves of who the murderer was. They thought it was a white man who had voodoo magic. You're thinking to yourself, why voodoo magic? I mean, he killed them with an axe and not magic.
Right.
However, what we didn't say earlier is several of these victims had dogs. Outside dogs, inside dogs, I don't know, but they had dogs.
And you notice how in none of the reports we talked about the dog barking or the dog attacking the assailant?
There was no dog barking. There was no dog attacking. Here's the thing. None of the dogs were injured or hurt at all. They were just silent while their owners were being attacked, murdered, raped, and mutilated in terrible ways. Screaming, but no one heard the dog bark. The African American community couldn't figure out how this killer quieted these dogs. And so, of course, it's the 1800s. Magic is a thing that a lot of people believed in, and it's a scary time for them. So they're going to put out what their best theory is. And their best theory is that he used magic to stealth himself into these homes without their dogs noticing. And that's also how he got in and out of homes where there were other people sleeping.
Right.
So now who do we have?
Well, of course, those are just the speculated type of suspects. But as far as actual prime suspects, there are 2. One was a Malaysian cook and a butcher known only as Maurice. He worked at a small hotel that was called the Pearl House. Maurice, first of all, lived in the immediate neighborhood where all of this was taking place.
Yeah, when we talk about it, this is like within like
like
3 or 4
neighborhood.
blocks. It's like a little neighborhood.
Yes. He also was said to know pretty much every single cook and or kitchen servant in the entire area.
And considering all of the victims had ties or were cooks or kitchen help.
Right. The police had actually just started looking at Maurice as a suspect, and they go to his place of work to get some more information on him when, they talked to his boss and they found out that he's gone. Just 1 week after the last murder, Maurice had gone to his boss at the Pearl House and informed them that he was going to be leaving, as he had accepted a job on a ship.
So a sailor.
A cook on a ship. And to be exact, a short time later, he was gone. Guess where he moved to? When they questioned Mrs. Schmidt, who was the owner of the Pearl House, she informed investigators that Maurice had come to her, basically said that he was going to be taking off on this ship and was looking to start a new life in London, in Whitechapel, where just 2 years later, very similar murders would begin to happen.
Where one of the suspects was a sailor of Malaysian descent who went by the name of Alaska.
So that's two of the suspects in this case were, at least at one point in time or another, believed to be a possible suspect for Jack the Ripper. And this last one, a prime suspect in Austin, is also one of the better known suspects in the Jack the Ripper case. And we're not even done yet.
We're not. So you mentioned there was 2 prime suspects.
Yep.
Now, Maurice being one. The second was a 19-year-old cook named Nathan Elgin. Now, Mr. Elgin had lived in Austin since he was 14 years old. So he'd seen the city built up and he knew his way around. He was not considered a suspect. At the time when they did all the arrests and everything, he was not. It wasn't until February of 1886, 2 months after the double homicide on Christmas Eve, that he became a suspect. On February 9th, 1886, Nathan Elgin grabbed a woman out of a saloon in a town close to Austin. He abducted her with witnesses. He drug her down the street and to another house. There, he attempted to rape her and branded a knife. The woman fought back. Her screams could be heard up and down the street, and the police were alerted. When the police arrived with the barkeep from the saloon, they pulled Nathan off of the woman, who was still alive and still fighting. He began swinging his knife at them. At this point, the policeman took out his gun and shot the suspect to death.
So other than having kind of a similar MO, what actual ties does Nathan have to the actual murders? Well, first of all, there's the fact that this particular attack was very similar to what happened in the previous attacks. A woman is taken forcefully to another location. He then attempted to rape her and stab her, and there had been at least one case previously where an axe wasn't used, instead it was a knife. And of course, all of these things being things that happened in the previous murders. Then there's the case of Christmas Eve, 1885, the night of the double event. Turns out that on that night, Nathan's wife was giving birth to their very first child. And let me tell you, Nathan, he was so super excited to become a dad. You know what he did?
No.
He didn't go to the birth.
Was he busy?
We don't know where he was, but he wasn't there. Is it possible he was off killing and raping 2 women? Maybe. Oh, right. And you remember the fun case that had the bloody footprints that led away, that had some kind of unusual...
The little toes missing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
Well, who knew? But Nathan Elgin was missing the little toe on his right foot.
So his footprint I mean, they didn't actually do like fingerprints and footprint, but yeah.
They didn't have that stuff back then.
No.
There was no fingerprinting back in these days.
But when you're missing a digit, that's a unusual,
pretty damning sign.
Yeah. So, I mean, it couldn't be Maurice then, because, Nathan has the missing toe.
Right. It's gotta be.
Or could it be both of them? We have a theory on this.
And this is one of those bear with us type situations, but I promise it is not like the anagram situation.
Back in
this
fun with the anagram.
And it worked. But this one actually could be a thing.
So, as I mentioned, Nathan was a cook. Maurice was a cook. So, Maurice knew all the cooks in town. He was well known in the area and stuff. So, my theory is he could have been mentoring Nathan in cooking and maybe in more.
Like actually grooming him to become a murderer. Earlier on, we made it a point to only mention the canonical victims. There were, however, several other victims that were attacked during this time frame that either there wasn't enough to kind of solidify the fact that they were connected, or the MO was different,
or they didn't
or
die.
what have you, or they didn't die, what have you. But a number of things were different enough that they weren't considered to be canonical victims. We also mentioned earlier on that there was a series of attempted break-ins at the time. So keeping all of that in mind, let's look at a few things. First of all, whomever committed these murders was absolutely just brazen, bold. They knew what they were doing.
It's even with the first murder, even with Molly Smith, like the axe work alone was aggression and confidence, and there was no hesitation.
Right.
She was also, you got to think the time frame, it was quick, and so was the second one.
Yes.
The second one, Irene Cross, was very quick.
And like you said, that first murder being done with confidence. She was the cook.
Yes.
So while there was also a man there who was also attacked, and granted he survived, the target in this was most likely the cook, because as we've mentioned, there was a cook or a kitchen worker involved in every case. She did die. So the job was done, and it was done successfully. Then you take into consideration some of the other murders that we've already mentioned a couple of times now, where you've got 4 people in a room or 2 or 3 people in the same room, and things are happening with no one taking notice, dogs that don't bark, things like that. So you've got great stealth involved.
Yeah.
You've got great strength involved. A lot of strength involved. I mean, there's a number of women that are being forcefully taken to other places and brutally raped and murdered.
Yeah.
That takes strength. Being able to knock 4 people out. Granted, they were sleeping, and they said they used a sandbag to knock them out. So to be able to, a sandbag's got some weight to it, but you gotta put some oomph into it to be able to render someone unconscious.
But to be able to do it at such a precision that you don't wake everybody else up.
Exactly.
And that you knock them out and don't kill them right away.
That takes strategy, it takes stealth, it takes strength. Especially when you consider, at least like the 4 people, one of them was a larger guy.
Yeah, Orange Washington was not a small man.
He's a big dude.
And not just that, but, his wife is right next to him. And I just know he was probably very protective of her. So I don't see him giving way to a weakling.
No.
So then, taking all that into account, taking all that strength and confidence and brazen boldness, but also with precision, you look at Nathan's last act. You look at
the polar opposite.
Yeah, it was sloppy. And when we say that, thank God it was sloppy, because that woman survived.
Yeah.
But it was sloppy. He attempted to take a woman with witnesses from a public place. He drug her down the street, letting her yell for everyone to hear, alerting the cops. He pulled her in to a house. That makes it a little bit different too, because it's inside.
Yeah.
This killer likes to pull them
always
out.
In the backyard.
Yeah,
every
always
time.
Out, or the vacant lot.
Or a vacant lot one time.
But always outside. He pulls her inside, tries to rape her and stab her. And he did stab her a couple times, but he didn't get to rape her. He was fighting with her. She was overpowering him, or at least equal powering him.
You got to keep in mind, this is before cell phones, right? Like a good 100 years before cell phones.
Yeah.
So someone had to go and find a police officer and tell them what happened.
And they had to come.
And then they had to come all the way to this house, find the house. Follow the screams. But if we're being generous, it's going to take at least 10 to 15 minutes, maybe.
We'll say, okay, we'll give him this. What if he lived right around the corner? What if a policeman lived right around the corner? It's still going to take like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But not only that, but she was a woman who had been drinking at a bar, and she had enough strength to fight this
and he has a
man
knife.
off. He has a knife, and she's still fighting him off.
Manages to fight him off, and manages to continue to fight him off until the police arrive. So, several minutes.
Not only that, he did stab her, but nothing fatal. Nothing precise.
Yeah, no.
It was sloppy. And when the police got there with the saloon manager or the barkeep or bartender, they actually pulled Nathan off.
And the report said that they pulled him off with perfect ease.
And he started slashing at them, and that is when they shot him. It's really hard to imagine this 19-year-old. I know he was a man, because you're a man at 19, but 19-year-old boy, because in my mind they're a boy. Sure. 19-year-old boy held off by a woman who'd been drinking, had not done precision, had not done stealth, had not done any of the things that made the Servant Girl Annihilator so deadly. And to be able to be pulled off easily in the midst of a rage attack, it doesn't quite...
Yeah, so let's break this down. If there is one killer, on the one hand, you've got someone who can walk into a room with 4 people, knock them all unconscious, then go back and strike them all with an axe, then drag a woman 75 feet, take the time to rape her and brutally kill her.
While she's fighting back.
While fighting back, at least up until the moment that she actually dies. And in that exact same case, still then have the energy to chase down a woman who's getting away.
At least 75 feet. Like, if he was still killing...
It specifically says he drugged the victim, Gracie, 75 feet away from the house.
Right.
So you're now coming from 75 feet away. This person's running the opposite direction, and he runs from there all the way over to here with enough speed and strength to catch her, tackle her, and wrestle her to the ground, only letting her go when the owner of the house comes out.
Not only that, but he did that in a dress.
Yeah, in a dress. Yes, right, exactly. And on the other hand, you have Nathan, who couldn't kidnap a woman without witnesses, who couldn't overpower a woman, and who got busted immediately.
Well, and if Nathan had been the killer all along, like he went a whole year without getting caught,
only to then completely forget everything that he's done and screw up that badly.
But if you put them together,
yes.
Maurice and Nathan, teacher and student,
everything starts to suddenly make a lot of sense.
All of the cases make more sense if there's 2 people. Being able to overpower that many people, being able to contend with children in the room,
being able to contend with pets,
being able to have someone be a lookout or something like that. If Nathan and Maurice work together, then some of these cases become way more achievable.
You remember whenever we told you to remember the Gracie and Lucinda case, whenever there was a man that chased down Lucinda. Well, it would make a lot more sense if Maurice was killing Gracie, and then it was the much younger, much quicker Nathan who then chased down and tackled Lucinda.
Also, you've taken into account the only eyewitness who gave any description other than a big man in a dress, and that is Douglas. Douglas being the nephew of Irene Cross. He said a big, chunky black man with no shoes and his pants rolled up was the one that threw him to the ground and covered him up. I don't know how big Nathan was. I couldn't find the information, but I feel like if he's being fought off with this woman and he's easily taken while he's in a rage, trying to, because these murders were rage.
Swinging a knife around.
Yeah, these murders, if he was the murderer, these murders are full of rage. That is a hard person to get off of someone.
And yet the report specifically says they ran in and with ease pulled him off.
Yeah.
That's not a large, chunky man.
Yeah, but Maurice, being of Malaysian descent, they tend to be very, like, big, bulky men. So my theory is it was both of them.
And we don't know this for sure. Like we said, take this with a grain of salt. It's just our theory. But all of these cases, all of them, make more sense if there are 2 people involved. So going back to Douglas and what Douglas said, the large chunky man, that describes Maurice. And yet at the exact same case, what do we get? We get bloody footprints.
And the knife.
And the knife.
You got to think about this. If Maurice was training Nathan to be a killer, one, The murder stopped when Maurice left town.
Maurice left
And
town,
the
and Nathan died.
the only other case that links Nathan to it happened 2 months later.
Yeah.
So he was getting his confidence, and he was not quite as confident as his teacher.
And he obviously wasn't as good with it because you
Oh.
have all of the attempted break-ins. You have the
Yeah.
women being grabbed on the street. This is probably when Maurice saw all this and was like, hey, let me show you a better way.
And this is where I came into thinking it was two separate people, but they worked together. All of the other cases, the murder weapon was an axe, except for Irene.
Yeah.
Irene is a knife. Nathan was found not with an axe, but with a knife. What if his teacher was the axe murderer and he was more comfortable with a knife?
Not to mention the other one where there was an axe and also other puncture wounds and neither weapon was found. That was both of them he's like, okay, get in on this.
I started it, you finish it. I know that sounds morbid and I hated saying that just now, but
right.
It makes more sense that there were two of them and that it stopped because Maurice left town. So the axe murdering stopped, and then Nathan was trying to attempt to be as confident as his teacher.
But he got cocky.
But he got cocky, and he screwed up, and then he got shot. But right now, what do you guys think? Do you think our theory holds weight? Do you think that there were two killers? Do you think they worked together?
Yeah.
Or do you think it was just one man going on a homicidal rampage?
Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. But that is the case of the Servant Girl Annihilator. So that's going to wrap it up for this week. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Make sure you follow us across all of our social media platforms.
Facebook, Twitter, Instagram.
With all of the things, yes. And please comment, like, share, subscribe, do all those wonderful YouTube things as well. Most importantly, however, drop us a comment. Let us know your thoughts on this case. Let us know your theories. But most importantly, let us know what you would like to see next in this series of enigmatic events. Thanks for watching.